Why is this
So I think we can get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first China Humanities Seminar of the year, first of the full semester. On behalf of my co-chairs, James Robson and Xiaofei Tian, we'd like to say thank you to the Mahindra Center, Fairbanks Center, and the Department EALC for their funding, for their generous funding at this time. We're really happy today to invite Professor Yao Zhuming from very far away, from Boston University. Professor Yao is an assistant professor of Chinese and comparative literature at Boston University. He got his PhD from the University of Princeton University. He's a specialist in classical Chinese literature, so early Chinese literature and sort of early medieval literature. And he's working on this really fascinating monograph at the moment, which is trying to sort of reconceptualize orality and how we think about classical Chinese literature. One of the arguments I think he's trying to make is that the oral is in many ways a product of written, and that the written sort of shapes how we think about the oral. So it's a very innovative project. He's published some of this research in Tongbao, a really wonderful article called Beyond Authenticity. And we're really grateful for him taking time out from his busy schedule and making this sort of long schlep across the Charles to come to Harvard to present his work today. So the title of this talk is The Early Chinese Lyric Eye Between Poetics and Hermeneutics. We'd also like to thank Zhang Yi for her preparations behind the scenes. And there's going to be sort of a reception after the talk that you're all more than invited to attend and to join us upstairs for a glass of wine to celebrate the beginning of the semester. Thank you, Professor Yao.
Thank you, Professor Kelly. So since joining BU, I've been sneaking in and out of this building really for many times, but it's a different experience to be actually invited. You read all the difference between being invited into a state and sneaking into a state in the Zhuozhuan, for example. But when you are actually experiencing that, that is really different. So thank you very much for that. And thank you all for making the time. So this is something that came out of my interest in voice, which was the topic of my dissertation, but I sort of went away from it and I wanted to do something that excites me, which is the Shijing. My plan today is to take up to maybe 45 minutes or so and trying to stop at most at 50 minutes and then so we can have a discussion for this topic. So my topic for today is called The Early Chinese Lyric Eye, without marks for reasons I'm going to explain, between poetics and hermeneutics. So this project basically started with a conundrum, I think, facing most readers. The conundrum is, on the one hand, there was simply way too many commentaries, and they're still being written. The one on the far right you see came out, I think, 4 or 5 years ago by some of the best scholars in China on the Shijing, and they make their own claims and discussions of earlier texts. But when you actually read these commentaries and try to choose from them, what you get are not simply different glosses of words in the poem. Oftentimes what you get are completely different poems altogether. It's the same poem, same title, same sets of words, but their interpretation makes them into a completely different poem. And this is especially the case in my reading of these materials when it comes to the lyric eye, which is the poems that starts with the eye or has an eye in it. Now, on the other hand, we really cannot read the Shijing without the commentaries for a number of reasons. First of all, a lot of the poems are simply too difficult. And second of all, when you compare variants of the Shijing, which is what you can get from some commentaries, what they tell you is that the Mao text already writes its own readings into the wordings of the poem. So there are theories about how these poems used to be oral and they were textualized. So when you choose a word for it, the Mao reading already builds some of the interpretations into it. And then when you compare to all of that to the more recent materials, and I'm showing you only one of the manuscript materials, it also shows that not only the words are different, the stanza order can be very, very different. So if you choose a different commentary, chances are you choose a different reading or poem altogether than if you choose a different one. Which is all to say that there is really no such thing as the original shi, and there's also no such thing as the original meaning of shi. So here's the dilemma, but what do we do with it? And I have two answers. The short one is practically there's nothing you can do about it. End of talk. But the longer version is that when you actually look across all these different commentaries, it shows us something that I think allows us to choose whichever commentary you want to go with in whichever way you want. And there are two things I want to mention for today's talk. One is that in terms of the lyric I, which is the topic for today, readers, by which I mean commentators throughout the 2 millennium, they treat it not as a referential, but rather as a deictic word. A referential, as we know, has a definite referent, like Yao Zhuming is a proper noun, but when you say I, it really depends on the context for the meaning of it, which is also to say that this lyric I can be inhabited by whoever is reading it or trying to make sense of it. And in fact, I want to show it very briefly today too, that not only readers in the capacity of commentators inhabited all these I's as a deictic, but the writers of early lyric poetry also started writing lyric poetry by inhabiting some of the I's that I would call type voices. Second is that our commentators, when you read all through them, they tend to pass off poetic claims as hermeneutic solutions, which is to say, in explaining what a poem means, what they gave us is really how a poem is composed, in what rhetorical mode, or using whatever poetic devices and so forth. So you read their theories about how this poem came into being. Now, for me, I think both of these have implications for larger studies of Chinese. The first, I would say, makes us question the significance of the Great Preface in actual readings of the Shi itself. We tend to think of the Great Preface as the guiding principle of lyric poetry and the reading. But the assumption that lyric poetry has to be autobiographical, spontaneous, transparent, is really not at all prevalent among these commentators who wrote their text about the poems. And the second, and this is another larger interest of mine, I think makes us rethink this thing called philology in a more balanced way. There is a tendency to think of philology as hard science and objective and all that. But I want to show that a lot of the times, I would go so far as to say philology is inseparable from literary tastes and literary judgments. And oftentimes it's nothing but literary judgments. And I'll show you some of that too. So for the rest of my time, I would like to show you, first of all, one poem which has been read in seven different ways, which also became 7 completely different poems. And then very briefly, I would like to show you how writers of early lyric poetry started writing lyric poems by inhabiting I's in the at the time. So now, this is Mao number 3, Zheng and this is by far the most dividing poem in terms of how people understood the lyric I. And for analytical purposes, I present the poem in a very some sort of disjointed word-by-word. All of these are based on the Mao glosses. So I'll just read it out loud so we can look at this very quickly because we'll be making references back to it all the time. So it says, pick and pluck the cocklebur does not fill slender basket. Sighing for my person I hold dear, place them the ranks of Zhou. Ascend thou tall and towering, my horse haggard and staggered. I for the moment pour into that bronze wine cup. Verily by means of that not prolong the yearning. Ascend that high ridge, my horse dark yellow, I for the moment pour into that right picture. Verily by means of that not prolong the sorrow. Ascend that earth-filled hill, my horse already exhausted, my groom already worn out, oh how miserable it has been. So this is the poem, which I think is familiar to many of us. Now, according to the minor preface, Zheng, and I put all the Chinese on the right half, and I'll read out the translation so you can look at it while I go through it. So according to the minor preface, Zheng is the intent, the zhi, right, of the queen. She assists the nobleman in his search for the worthies and his inspection of his officers. And she understands the toil and struggle of his subjects. Deep inside, she harbors the intent to advance the worthy without a mind either treacherously biased or selfishly motivated. Day and night, she fills her thought with the nobleman to the point that anxiety afflicts her. So all the Chinese will be on the right. Now, as with most poems in the Zhounan section of the Guofeng, the heirs of the state, the Mao reading connects Juar to the queen consort of King Wen. And in this particular case, it also equates the poetic utterance with the queen consort's zhi, will or aspiration, as we tend to translate it. Although the Mao glosses do not explicitly say this, this would mean common understanding that the poem was composed by the queen consort, or at least uttered in her own voice. And Zhen Xuan and Kou Yingda, who follows Mao, they go further to actually expand on the glosses. They agree, for example, that the first couplet here is an invocation of sorrow. It's a xing, as we all know in the Shijing, and the repeated picking and plucking of the cockleburr versus the not filling of the slanted basket evokes sorrow, because that image of a absent-minded plant gatherer, supposedly a she, is elsewhere at the mind. Now, this image of an absent-minded woman sets the affective stage for the. As Kou Yingda notes after this, he says, the queen consort's sorrowful longings are deep and profound, just like the gatherer, the plant gatherers. And this is why the following couplet, he says, speaks of the queen consort's mournful signing. I yearn for the nobleman's employment of worthy people, which means I wish for the nobleman to go to place those worthy officials in the ranks of Zhou so they can be made ministers of the central court. The I here, he continues to say, is the I of the queen consort herself. So put together, the stanza in the Mao and Zhen Xuan and Kou Yingda reading, what translates into something like this. And I use she to mark that this is the xing, which is not actually the speaker. So it will translate into she picks and plucks the cockleburr, but could not fill her slanted basket. I sigh for the man of my heart, I here being the queen consort, he shall place them worthies in the rank of Zhou. Interestingly and surprisingly, this reading is not seen in any modern edition or translation of this poem. In those cases, the pronouns that we have here in the first stanza are taken to be the same I. And here, for example, is James Legg's translation. And he says, I was gathering the mouse here, but could not fill my shallow basket. With a sigh for the man of my heart, I place it there on the highway. And there are other differences, but what's very immediate here is that the xing, the use of evocation, is gone. There's no xing, at least in this translation. Now, the second stanza features two wo, or two eyes, that Zhen Xuan and Kou Yingda took great care to identify because Mao didn't. Now, the first eye, the one with the horse, refers to, according to them, our journeying officer. Is wo shi cheng ye. And the second, the one pouring wine, refers to our Lord. So following Zhen Xuan, Kou Yingda offers us this explanation on the meaning of, he says, he who the queen consort says ascends towering heights is our journeying officer. Our journeying officer, on account of military duties, went out and away from his position. His body already strained from trekking through the dangers of the mountains. His horse is now haggard and ill. Our Lord ought to know about all that. If the officer manages to return, our Lord should pour him the wine of the bronze cup and requite him with the feasting ceremonies of Xiang and Yan. I then, thanks to that, will no longer be drowned in empty. The reason I have all these sorrowful yearnings is that I fear that our Lord is unaware. Now, it's not an unreasonable reading on its own, and it's certainly in alignment. But if you think about it, this reading can partly be supported by the stanza itself as a poem. Now, neither Zhen Xuan nor Kou Yingda actually circles back to the poetic side process, but because both of them follow Mao in thinking that this poem is voiced by the queen consort himself, their glosses would produce a new stanza that would read something like this. Ascending those towering heights, our officer's horse is haggard and staggered. Our Lord, please fill those bronze wine cups, so I shall not forever yearn. Now, the problem here is not with the plural rendition of the two eyes, because wo in classical literary Chinese can be both singular and plural, and my translation of these two into the plural simply reflects my interpretation. The problem here is really with the referential capacity of the I. Right? As a first person pronoun, which I is, the two I cannot refer to, in my view, much less stand in for two different identities in such quick succession as these two neighboring lines. Unless, and I think there's an exception, unless each is voiced by the original owner of the respective wall. Yet, for that to work, the stanza would have to behave as if in the manner of a dramatic performance, which will then look like this. The officer says, ascending those towering heights, my horse is haggard and staggered. And the Lord says, the Junzi says, I shall for now fill those bronze wine cups. And the queen will follow up by saying, and I will no longer yearn. Interesting. But now if we go back to the original reading that Zheng Xuan proposed for us, James Legge actually made a comment on the two glosses. And he says of all the glosses from those two commentators, these two are the most licentious of all. Likewise, Zhu Xi made another note. He says the two different eyes cause the beginning and end of the poem to splinter and disconnect. It is not. It is also not in accordance with the genre style of. That being the case, they all read it or think this should be the same I. We still have no idea, or the idea is still debated as to this person riding a horse, pouring a drink, and ceasing to yearn. If it's the same person, who is this person? Despite all that, in Zheng Xuan Kuangda's glosses, the dual reading continues, the dual wall reading continues to the rest of the poem, which I show here. And because stanza 3, this one, largely repeats stanza 2, both of them simply note that the repetition of the stanza aims to extend the poet's. I didn't do the translation because it's the same. But when the repetition starts to break down in stanza 4, this last stanza, Zheng Xuan once again tries to fill in all the reference of the final two I's highlighted here in red. And he says, this stanza speaks of the mutual indisposition of the groom and the horse. That is, the horse of the journeying officer, as he was laboring on a military expedition. When the stanza then says how much his sorrow must have been, those are words of deep sympathy. Accordingly, the last stanza would read like the following if we still think that the queen consort is the. So, ascending those earth-filled hills, our officer's horse exhausted, and our officer's groom ill. Oh, woe, oh, the misery. Now, what we have here then is a poem that begins with the queen consort's lament and hope. It was then followed by her recount of the journeying officer's affliction and her hope for the king to requite him on his return. And then it ends with the queen's prolonged sympathy for the officer's ongoing toil. This is a perfect reading of the minor preface into the poem, despite all the difficulties that I've been trying to show with the I's. No war or I in the same poem, believed to have been uttered by the same voice, I think, can mean I, our journeying officer, our Lord, and each of the three possessive forms at the same time. Now we start over. Now, compared to all that, few other commentators later on actually feel nearly. For them, poetic convention is to be respected, in that the I's have to remain consistent, at least at the stanza level. Whether across the stanzas the I's are still the same, or whose voices they represent, is still widely debated. We have a Lu reading of the Shi, and it reads the Juan as the longing for the Asian nobleman's employment, worthy people, and their placement in ranked positions. Now, this statement itself is unclear in several ways, but this reading at least differs from the Mao reading by not mentioning the queen consort to be in some ways relevant to this poem. To Wang Xianqian, who gave us the Lu reading, this reading is evidence to him that the poem actually has a completely different author. And Wang Xianqian says this. He says, presumably, King Wen at the time took the employment of worthy people as his utmost urgent concern. Those cliff nesting and valley hiding worthies would not come out of reclusion, so he, not quailing at the assiduous toils of treacherous treks, brought himself to pursue them. That is how there were the matters of the towering heights, higher ridges, horses in illness, and groom failing to exhaustion. The king's hunt for Lu Shang by the Pan stream and lifting of Taidian and Feng Yao out of mountains are all clear proof of it. In other words, this poem is no longer the queen consort's, but King Wen's first-person narration of his lament. It tells us the king's physical and psychological pain of trying to reinstall the talents of the previous regime, not of the current regime, in his own regime. Now, to support this reading, Wang Xianqian has to contest several key glosses in the Mao Zhen and Gong reading. First, he takes the first stanza to be talking about the admiration of the distant age, Mu Yuan Shi. And second, he reads the Zhou in Zhou Ham as bian, everywhere widely. So that's turning the entire phrase into everywhere in the official rank, Zhou supposedly. Third, he glosses the Wo in Jie Wo Huai Ren as King Wen himself, and the Ren as the noble person of the past, and is the person of the past, not of the present. With that, Wang Xianqian takes the first couplet to be sighing for Mai, that is King Wen's longing for the noble person of the past, and for the placing of those worthies everywhere in his King Wen's ranks. The rest of the poem, Wang Xianqian simply says, speaks about the king's distant journey in pursuit of the worthies. Like the Zheng and Kuo that valorization of the Ma reading, Wang's elevation of the Lu reading also puts strain on the poem. He does not say much about the first couplet beyond all the glosses he just provided, but Yao Jihen has actually noted this before him, and he says, the picking of cockleburs and the carrying of baskets are, after all, more business. You don't have to mind the misogynist element in there, but the connotation here is basically, now how would those images fit into a poem supposedly voiced? Wang Xianqian makes no mention at all of this potential problem to the reading. The only thing he says, interestingly, is that this couplet, according to him, could function either as Xing avocation or Fu exposition, Fu Li Xing as the three rhetorical devices, but he doesn't go further to say, why that is the case, and what each of them would entail. Yao Jihen, who, as you saw earlier, also attributes the poem to King Wen, says explicitly that Fu is an impossibility. It's impossible to be Fu, because Fu, at least in our common understanding and the Wang Xianqian's understanding, implies a description of the poet's, let's say, actual experiences and observations. It wouldn't be something imagined. So instead, to actually complement Wang's idea of his gender roles that he mentioned earlier, Yao Jihen's gender roles, he says that the couplet has to be an instance of bi, comparison. So you pick Fu Bi Xing, right? Has to be one of them. And he says, alternatively, the first stanza functions as the mode of bi. To speak about the picking of cockleburs, one still fears not filling the baskets. How much more so is the pursuing of the worthy to be placed in the ranks. One truly fears that the court would not be filled. Now, of the three poetic devices the Shi is known for, none is not a commentator's tool for interpretation, so far as I've seen. And as it actually happens rather frequently, how a poem employs the Fu Bi Xing, any one of them, depends on how the commentators want the poem to register its meaning. Furthermore, Wang's reading is actually challenged by his own erudition as a philologist. I go back to Wang Qianqian's reading here, but his solution, for the most part, culminates in nothing but arbitrary claims made about either the poem or the source materials he consults for all those glosses. For the phrase here, Jinglei, the bronze wine cup, for example, Wang Xianqian finds many sources that describe it as the drinking vessel used not by a ruler, but by an officer, a high officer for the most part, a dafu or something like that. But because Wang Xianqian takes King Wen to be the speaker, he says the poem must have been composed before King Wen became a king. So everything will now make sense. In other words, he accepts the gloss, but this allows it from complicating his authorship claims. By contrast, there is a parallel phrase, 四贡, the rhinoceros picture in the next couplet. In this case, Wang Xianqian rejects all the other glosses he references, because only in that way can he maintain his authorship claim of King Wen. Basically, the idea is gong here is glossed elsewhere, especially in the Han school reading, as a kind of drinking cup used only when someone is being punished for being disrespectful to a superior. It is not, says Wang Xianqian, it is not, according to that gloss, a vessel used by a ruler or by a ruler to offer a drink to a guest. Now, but because King Wen, again, is presumed to be recounting his own journey here, Wang Xianqian says that this other gloss captures only the original purpose of the making of this particular picture. It does not apply to King Wen's time, or at least King Wen doesn't really matter. In other words, this gloss might be right, but it is really irrelevant here. Now, we go back again. I mentioned Yao Jihen's readings earlier, some of his readings. Now, Yao Jihen does not fully agree with Wang Xianqian, even though he also thinks that King Wen was the author of the speaker here. And Yao Jihen goes into a very long length in reviewing all the prior readings for his, and then he comes down to this claim. He says, this poem is indeed hard to interpret. But we should follow the Zhuozhuan and read it as King Wen's pursuit of worthy people to be employed in his government. Thinking that their journey is long and their arrival yet in sight, he composed the poem out of sympathy for the travails that they suffer on the road. And that, says Yao Jihen, seems to me the most straightforward reading. The Zhuozhuan reference need not concern us here because it doesn't say much. It only says, it quotes this couplet saying this is about putting people in offices. What is more interesting for my purpose here is Yao Jihen's reading, which is far more of an inventive take on the poetics of the Juan. Because for King Wen to have composed a poem out of sympathy for the journeying officers, who he says, whose road is far and arrival is yet in sight, the last three stanzas that Wang Xianqian earlier read as the King Wen's account of his own journey would now have to be understood as King Wen's imagination of the officers to him. It's not King Wen making a journey to the officers, but them to him. In poetic terms, what follows the first stanzas is the poet's basically impersonation of an imagined voice, or as some would call prosopopoeia. I understand this term rather broadly. As such, Yao Jihen's reading will translate into the following. And I mark also how he reads the rhetorical devices. So the first still the same, right? She picks, this is the xing, but he reads as be. And then King Wen says, I sigh for the man I long for, hoping to place them everywhere in my ranks. And I only give you the second stanza because the rest is the same. And notice the quotation marks here because this is imagined here. And this is King Wen now impersonating his officers. I ascend those towering heights, my horse is haggard and staggered. I now fill those bronze wine cups to stow my prolonged yearning. Now, traditional literary criticism has not prepared us for prosopopoeia in lyric poetry. The rhetorical device, as we know, occurs typically in performative genres like the Yuefu or the Songci. In the Shijing, however, the use of prosopopoeia is first and very frequently by none other but Zhu Xi. Typically, he would use these words, tuo or tuoyan, to refer to prosopopoeia and other figurative use of language, the kind of things that the traditional Fu Bixing does not describe. Now, in the case of the Juar, Zhu Xi reads the poem in its entirety as a tuoyan, as a interested speech, which really entails a highly unusual mode of poetic speech, at least in terms of how we understand the classical poetry. So compared to the other commentators I have mentioned so far, Zhu Xi's hermeneutic innovation is no less facilitated. Now, to begin with, the poem to Zhu Xi has nothing to do with the employment of the worthy, whether it was an earnest wish on the part, whether it was an earnest wish the Queen Consort holds for King Wen, which was the Mao reading, or an aspiration the King Wen himself labors to fill, which was Wang Xianqian's reading following the Lu reading. And it was also not a shared goal pursued now by the people drawn to King, which is Yao Jihen's reading. Rather, according to Zhu Xi, the poem was narrated full here because the Queen Consort was longing for the nobleman, i.e. King Wen, who was away from her. From this poem, Zhu Xi also says, we can see how utterly chaste, subdued, loyal, and devoted was. The use of the word fu here is apropos because Zhu Xi marks the entire poem as a fu. In this case, a fu made by the queen consort herself. So 后妃自作. Especially with regard to the first stanza, it is not a xin as we saw in the Mao reading, or b as in Yao Jihen's reading, but now a fu. Now, following his overall claim that this is queen consort narrating a poem all by Zhu Xi says of the first stanza in this way. He says, this is interested speech, 拖延, in which the queen consort was picking the cockle. Before the slanted basket was filled, her heart turned to long for the nobleman and thus cannot pick anymore. So she let the basket down by the side of the broad road. 周之大道. Two things I think merit our attention here. First, the couplet is not taken to be an ordinary fu, but a fu of an entrusted speech, 拖延. The queen consort basically misses the king, so she entrusts a stanza about the picking of cockleburr to express her longings for the king. This is not true poetics as conventionally understood, because again, conventionally, fu is an unfigured sequence of narration or description. As Zhu Xi actually says himself, I think in the Zhuzi Yulei, to straightforwardly refer to names and straightforwardly narrate events is. How then, you would ask, can the queen consort narrate an analogy basically to her debilitating longings? Zhu Xi does not give us an explanation, but one could make speculations. Zhu Xi has this belief, first of all, that the authorship of this poem is still the queen consort. And as we all know, when Zhu Xi reads love poems, he tends to read them as licentious poems. So if the queen consort, which is a proper exemplary woman, is the author, then she sort of has to speak of desires in codes. Otherwise, it would not be proper. It would be licentious. So now, along with this very, I think, iconoclastic reading, the controversial phrase "zhouxing" or "zhouhang," you can, I think, pronounce it either way, in the couplet is now glossed as a broad road. No explanation given either. As noted earlier, philological investigation is oftentimes not an objective process. Commentators bring their own judgments to the words in the poems, depending on what they wanted to say. Having reinterpreted the first stanza, Zhu Xi reads the rest of the poem also in the queen consort's voice. But he says a bit more about that. And this is the Ziyou. He says, this part, again, is entrusted speech, 拖延, in which the queen consort wishes to mount the towering heights so as to gaze afar at the man of her heart, after whom she will now follow. But her horse is too haggard to advance, so she pours herself the wine of the bronze cup, hoping to, with it, not fall further into her unceasing longings. If you understand that way, the treacherous journey is no longer the king one's, which is Wang Xi. It is not the worthy subjects in the queen consort's recount, which is the. It is also not the subjects in King Wen's imagination, which is Yao Jihen's reading. Now, to Zhu Xi, this is in the queen consort's own imagination. The poet is impersonating an imagined self, encoding at the same time her unfelt longing for her husband into a metaphorical trek into the mountains. So imagination in figuration is how I sort of describe this. No other shi in any of the readings I have come across is this double-figured, like Zhu Xi's reading of these very short couplets. No other shi in Zhu Xi's own reading is this kinetic on the literal surface, but static in its interpretation. If you think about it, there's no actual picking of cockleburrs, no real ascending of the mountains, no midway drinking, no horses, no servants. Everything narrated here takes place in the queen consort's imagination as she longs for King Wen. Now, this is a very unusual reading, but the unusualness of it did not go unnoticed. The Ming scholar Yang Shen, for example, rebuts Zhu Xi this. He says, a woman longs for her husband, so she ascends a high ridge and drinks wine, taking her servants to gaze from afar. Even though this was spoken of, it still goes against the principal proprieties. The Qing commentator of the Shi Cui Shu goes further. He says, Master Zhu's reading of the poem as a woman's lying for her husband is correct. But to take the I as the wife herself, who ascends high to drink wine, is decidedly not the way of a virtuous wife who ought to be cloistered and chaste. Even to regard it as the words of entrusted speech, Toyan, is still improper. Although, as you can see, both of these disapprovals are made rather on anything poetically based, they nevertheless highlight the unconventionality of Zhuxi's reading. And I go back to Zhuxi's reading. As with the first claim of Toyan made on the first couplet, Zhuxi appears utterly uninterested in defending his reading. But from a poetic perspective, the second claim of Toyan translates to a rhetorical deployment of prosopopoeia that is truly uncharacteristic of the Shi or of poetry as the expression of Zhu. But again, to Zhuxi and all the other commentators I have mentioned, how a poem comes into being in terms of its use of Fu Bixing or anything is a function of their own interpretation of the poem. And that's really the extent of it. Now, if we step back a little bit and look at the longer history of Shi hermeneutics, Zhuxi is actually the last major commentator to have preserved some of the legacy from the minor preface, especially its authorship claims, which Zhuxi inherited for the Juan'er. Since then, Zhuxi's reading became the new orthodox for later commentators, and his tradition defying, I would say, stands on the I as prosopopoeia grew in tandem to be the insignia of that new orthodox. By which I mean a great number of later readings all take the last three stanza to be an impersonation. They differ only in the voices impersonated and the identity of the impersonator. And Toyan, as Zhuxi used it, also entered interpretive language of the Shi in general, assumed in many other poems. Now we have to start over again. Among later commentators, the man that was actually responsible for the lasting impact of Zhuxi's innovation and for the modern reading that you tend to come across of the Juan'er today is the lasting critic of the Shi, Fang Yurun. And as you can imagine, I expect Fang also introduces his own twist into the I as prosopopoeia. Now, in Fang's time, in the late Qing, impersonation we know was already. In particular, male authors would adopt a female voice and speak about their political desires through the metaphor of romantic relationships. For readers and writers, I think this understanding was fairly common. But these assumptions about voices and gender roles are projected back onto who actually also holds very rigid views about female figures as they appear in poetry. Whenever he sees something improper or unlikely to be for the female to have said or done, he seeks to read a male into the poem in one way or another. For the Juan'er, for example, Fang Yuan accepts Yang Shen's criticism of Zhuxi and reads the final three stanzas not as the imagination of the female poet's own joy, but as that of her male lovers. And this is what he says. He says that this poem must have been composed by a woman out of her longing for her husband on an official journey and of her sympathy for his travails. The first stanza speaks of the thought of her man prompted by the picking of the cocklebur. The following three stanzas all describe, and I want to emphasize from the opposite side, in detailed imagination of the travails the man must have experienced. The woman strives to console herself, but the more she tries, the more she fails. And the woman here, Fu Ren, as you see, is no longer the queen consort herself, but an unnamed wife. Because to Fang Yuren, how is holding a basket and following a route the business of the queen consort? As such, we now have a fifth reading of the poem, this time completely divorced from either the queen consort or King Wen. All these historically contextualized readings give way now to a widely applicable reading that is folkish in nature. Any wife could have composed a poem so long as we understand the she to be impersonating a he. But Fang Yuren does not stop here, and that's what makes him interesting. And acknowledging that the poem can also be an entrusted speech, he brings his gendered hermeneutics to full circle by now positing an alternative reading, which is a male author in the background. And he says, if one has to read the poem as entrusted speech, then it only works, 乃可, when the poet is using the relation between husband and wife to metaphorically speak of the relation between a ruler and the subject, orbiting friends. Once we stop obsessing with the queen consort, then the intention to speak of the pursuit of the worthy and the inspection of the officers will also not be unreasonable, right? Because it'll be a man who's thinking all about that. In other words, typical of a gendered reading, the poem is taken to be a male poet speaking figuratively through the voice of a female. Now, although he's not the first to have read a later poetic paradigm, I would say, into the Shi, Fang Yuren is the most consistent in doing so. On many occasions, he would read a poem as a male impersonation of a female when all other commentators either agree on female authorship or remain undecided. He's the only exception there. The only difference lies in whether the impersonated voice is taken to be speaking figuratively or non-figuratively. Just again, not by anything poetic, but by Fang's view of gender roles. Nevertheless, this initial folkish female poet impersonating a male lover reading, that reading became the preferred reading of most modern commentators. In addition to, for example, Guo Moruo, Chen Junying, Jiang Jianyuan, and most recently Yuan Xingpei, Xu Jianwei, this reading is also the reading behind Whaley's translation. Which I provide here. We don't really have to read it, but notice the quotation marks. This is where the imagination impersonation begins. Notice also a little footnote here, and he says, in the first verse, it is the lady left at home who speaks. In the remaining verse, it is the man away on a perilous journey. Okay. Now, James Legge, by contrast, adopts Fang's second figurative, a male poet impersonating a female reading as a friend lamenting the absence of another friend. Again, we don't have to read it because it's more or less the same, but he also gives us a note saying this poem laments the absence of a cherished friend. And he says, Zhuxi says this is the queen consort, but we must read it as if it was from the pencil of its subject, meaning the man. So now, and this I'm coming to the end of this part, only Chen Zhongshu offers us something truly remarkable, and yet still derivative of the Persopopoeia-based reading proposed by these readers. So instead of a poet speaking of his own or her own mind, and then impersonating the target of his or her longings, whoever those people are, Chen Zhongshu thinks that the person who composed the poem need not be the person chanted in the poem. The wife and the husband are both characters in the poem, and the poet spoke about their affairs on their behalf. That is why the wife and the husband each says I, respectively. 各曰我. Put in a different way, the poet Chen Zhongshu is not impersonating one, but two imagined voices in a dramatic manner that now completely erases the identity of the I behind all the eyes. And very revealingly, none of these commentators defend their readings in any serious way. To the extent they do, they tend to cite later poetic conventions, or in the case of Chen Zhongshu, storytelling technique in later imperial fiction. He says this is 话从两头说, talk about the same thing from two different ends. So now these interpretations are matched, and these very free interpretations are matched only by the impositions they bring onto the poetics of the genre. By now, we have still one title, still 4 stanzas, still the exact same title and same 4 stanzas, but 7 completely different poems altogether. They don't resemble each other in any way. The genre is only one among many poems in the Shijing that have inspired diverging readings of the I. Although in this particular case, you have a very complex poem with multiple is enacted right in the poem. Other poems, other lyric members of the Shi may not explicitly say I, but they nonetheless are voiced in the first person and still illustrate a narrow range of contentions over the I. But overall, I would like to highlight 3 main areas that people are debating. First of all, the first has to do with whether the poet is a historically identified or a more generic type of personality. If you want a historical person, you would look for a specific name. If you're okay with a generic personality, then people are content with, let's say, a forlorn wife, an indignant official, or a concerned countryman, because their identity either cannot be identified or need not be identified. The second is gender. as it occurs very often in the commentaries, that the poetic speaker is a she does not necessarily mean that the poet is also a she. And from gender, we quickly go to the third problem, which is figuration, which further boils down to the question of impersonation and all the use of poetic tropes and codes. So do you speak about, political desire through romantic relationships or not? So, but this has to do with the hermeneutic bias against female but not male on the part of especially late imperial commentators. To them, both the male author and the male voice has a lot more leeway in terms of poetic expression, while the female counterparts are subject to additional moral judgment. I'm trying to come to a conclusion very quickly now. But this is not to say, however, that there's only one correct reading of the German, or one of the readings is any better than any of the other readings. Or maybe we don't like the Mao reading because it really doesn't work in terms of how poetry is written. Rather, I think all these readings are just as plausible because, and this is the argument I want to make, the same I can be imagined to suit different speakers speaking under a variety of circumstances. And those who are doing the imagining are not only the readers, the commentators of the Shi, which is what I just showed, but also the writers of early lyric poetry, which I'll get to in like 2 minutes or so and wrap up. And for them, for the writers, and I think this is the second half of the argument, early lyric writers really began writing lyric poetry by inhabiting type voices or the I's in the type voices. So it doesn't matter whether you're a reader or a writer, when you're approaching the I, it is not a referential, but a didactic that you yourself will inhabit in certain ways. And I can do this very quickly through this trope that we all know, the frustrated scholar, right? Which is basically synonymous with the early Chinese conception, not only of lyricism, not only of lyric writing, but of authorship. And as we all know, when we think about the frustrated scholar, we think about Chu. Chu Yuan is credited as the first lyric poet. But I think, as is also familiar to most of you, that view has been disputed recently by, for example, Martin Kern and Professor Owen. In the volume, you can read that. The idea basically is that the figure is really the product of the poem instead of the other way around. What is less mentioned in all of these things, which is something that Sima Qian actually does, is that this trope appears already in a set of poems in the Shijing. If you go to the Xiaoya section and read from 185 something to 195 something, you encounter poems like this that are, in terms of its rhetoric, the exact same as what you would read in Juan. So basically, it boils down to two emotions, one lamentation, which you see actually a lot in here, and one indictment, right, or indignation. People are angry of their sufferings, and then they just go over through again and again and again and repeat the same in a full type of manner. What is even less mentioned, and which is something I want to insert into this entire matrix, is Liu Xiang. We don't have time to look at this, but Liu Xiang's Jiutan, I think, is very interesting because he imitates Chu Yuan's voice, he merges his own voice with Chu Yuan, and he tries to escape that voice, but he never succeeded. He always is thinking in terms of Chu Yuan, even though he did something to get out of it. So now what all this means, I think, is when we think about these voices, eyes, identity, with regard in particular to the frustrated scholar, there are three ways to think of it. One is there is what I call type voice in general. It could be anyone. All the readings, different interpretations are trying to read meaning into these type voices. The other, this is our Chu Yuan, and this is that type voice embodied particularly by this figure we know as Chu Yuan. But Chu Yuan was also not the only one. When you read Wang Yi, when you read Liu Xiang, there is the type voice in other manifestations. The only difference here is that unlike Chu Yuan, they are not furnished with a biography or with the tradition that is so celebrated for all of them. So all of these people is who I mean by that no one really became a lyric poet without at least in part being a type voice. If you have to ask me who is the exception, I would point to Yang Xiong in his Jie Chao. But that's not lyric poetry, that's a different topic, and that will be a thing for a different time. So let me try to wrap it up. I started with this idea that when early readers and writers were looking, it's not a referential work, but a didactic work. And then I showed you how both of them, from different perspectives, more in detail with regard to readers, actually inhabit eyes and ascribe meanings to it. This, I think, would have to give us something about how we think about lyric poetry. Right? Lyric poetry, at least in our traditional assumptions of what they are and how we read it, are autobiographical, transparent, right, and spontaneous. This is what the Daxu gives us. But a lot of these things you don't really see as a guiding principle was actual reading of these poems and in the earliest writing of lyric poetry. Those all came out of imitations of type voices. And lastly, I think there's also something for us to learn from this, which is that we sort of also do the same thing. When we read texts, when we try to interpret different themes, we are also trying to judge everything based on our own rationale, but also literary taste. But instead of getting into polemics, which these commentators do a lot of, or trying to insist on finding the one definitive answer, which again is what these commentators do. They get into very bad polemicals with early people. I think we should simply accept plurality. And this, I think, is actually how the Shijing remains a classic and how we still have to read those. That's all my talk. Thank you very much.